It's also a joy this morning as we continue with our live production to welcome those who are not at the conference but who may be watching live online. Thank you so much for the attention that you give us and the honor of attending our conference virtually. It seemed like a long time coming, but the day has come now when Timothy Long from Beverly Hills in California has an opportunity to speak to us. We've been looking forward to this. He has some important things to say about a new protocol. Timothy is the clinical director of Kainos Christian Therapy in Beverly Hills, California. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, but he's also a certified reintegrative therapist. I think it's important that he spent many years, probably a decade, working with Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Sr., and he now has the privilege of working with Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr., who is also a clinical psychologist. We hope to see him in Europe very soon. He's working on the development and training of reintegrative therapy, and you're so welcome, Timothy. Please come and share with us.
Thank you for having me. In the folders that have been on your chairs, there's a brochure for some training, some trainings that I'll start on a monthly basis starting next month. If you like what you're hearing today and you would like further training, this is online video training that I'll be doing. Please consider joining us. As the mass media has approached the topic of therapy for unwanted same-sex attractions, they have grouped everyone who provides treatment for unwanted same-sex attraction under one pejorative category, which is conversion therapy. This category allows them to identify professionals who provide safe, productive, evidence-based treatments with those who practice potentially harmful and sometimes coercive methods. No one can deny that categorizing us all together in this way has been an important part of attempts around the world to declare what we do unethical and to write laws which attempt to make what we do illegal. What I'm presenting to you today is an important part of our efforts to fight back against these attempts to marginalize us, silence us, and criminalize us. Reintegrative therapy is an approach crafted by Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. as an update to his late father's reparative therapy. Reintegrative therapy has been constructed as a treatment that can be standardized. Because it can be standardized, its practice can be regulated through a certification process currently under development by Dr. Nicolosi. If we can provide a standardized, manualized treatment method that we are formally certified in, we have considerably limited the ability of the mass media and opposition activists to wrongly categorize us as so-called conversion therapy. If you have the handout for my talk for today, or even within the folders that were on your seats when you came in, you'll see a 3-column table that compares and contrasts so-called conversion therapy and reintegrative therapy. Give you a moment to find that. Please read this in its entirety at your leisure. I want to highlight 2 points, okay? First, in the bottom right-hand box under the reintegrative therapy column, you'll see it says, treatment approaches are identical, regardless of the client's gender or sexual orientation. Yes, you heard that right. It does not matter what the client's presenting problem is, as long as it has an addictive, compulsive element, or it is trauma-related. Reintegrative therapy can be used effectively to treat it. I have roughly 40 sessions with clients per week. Of those 40, only 10 to 15 are with men who have unwanted same-sex attraction. I use reintegrative therapy with all my clients, regardless of their presenting problem. I want to emphasize this point even more by heightening it. Not only can the client be coming in with almost any presenting problem, a therapist could use reintegrative therapy to help a man with unwanted same-sex attraction regardless of that therapist's ideology. You heard me correctly. Using reintegrative therapy, a therapist could have a gay-affirming ideological worldview and potentially help a man resolve the emotional and relational issues underlying his same-sex attraction. As a byproduct, he would see diminishment in that man's same-sex attraction. That leads me to the second highlight on that compare and contrast table that you have in front of you. The second box down from the top right says, clients are not encouraged to try to change their sexual orientation. Rather, they resolve trauma and addictions using evidence-based treatment approaches. Changes in sexuality are the byproduct. This begs the question, a byproduct of what? The answer to this question is in Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Sr.'s primary text for reparative therapy, Shame and Attachment Loss. Right there. The work of Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, expounded in his book, Shame and Attachment Loss, can be summarized in 4 sentences. 1, homosexuality in men is a reparative drive that arises to resolve gender identity shame and defensive detachment from men. 2, this shame and defensive detachment was a result of attachment trauma and emotional neglect at key moments in a young man's development of his gender identity. 3, we can use corrective emotional experiences of compassion and affirmation to resolve the shame and defensive detachment that resulted from this trauma and neglect. And 4, as a man feels more confident and connected to his masculine identity, and as he develops secure attachments with other men, homosexuality is no longer needed as a reparative drive and spontaneously dissipates. Now, if your eyes are glazing over at this point, that is okay. There is actually only one sentence from what I just said that you need to hold on to and comprehend in order to be a master reintegrative therapist. I mean this. Comprehending and applying this next sentence is the essence of mastering reintegrative therapy. So I will repeat this sentence 3 times now. We use corrective emotional experiences of compassion and affirmation to resolve the shame and defensive detachment that resulted from attachment trauma and emotional neglect. 2, we use corrective emotional experiences of compassion and affirmation to resolve the shame and defensive detachment that resulted from attachment trauma and emotional neglect. Last time. We use corrective emotional experiences of compassion and affirmation to resolve the shame and defensive detachment that resulted from attachment trauma and emotional neglect. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We can all go home now. As you can see, there is nothing ideologically driven in that sentence. A therapist could be completely gay-affirming and agree with that sentence. And that is the only presupposition necessary for one to begin the journey toward mastering reintegrative therapy. There are 3 components of reintegrative therapy. These 3 components of reintegrative therapy are what any therapist will need to receive training in and demonstrate some mastery of in order to become certified as a reintegrative therapist. Now, the bulk of my talk today will be going into detail on the reintegrative protocol. And this protocol was just published in the Journal of Human Sexuality this month, so this is hot off the presses. I do want to be careful to clarify the distinction between reintegrative therapy and the reintegrative protocol. Reintegrative therapy is an overall approach to the treatment of trauma and addiction, while the reintegrative protocol is one component of that approach. Having said that, the reintegrative protocol is what distinguishes reintegrative therapy from other therapeutic approaches to emotional trauma and addiction. The second component is EMDR. I will not be spending time on this today, but if you are a professional therapist and you have not received formal EMDRIA-approved training in EMDR, run, don't walk, to www.emdria.org. Numerous research studies are being published that further establish EMDR as the gold standard in the treatment of emotional trauma. If you want to be on the cutting edge of trauma therapy, receive formal training in EMDR. The third component is Feeling State Addiction Protocol, or FSAP. FSAP arose out of EMDR. EMDR focuses on resolving traumatic experiences which have been maladaptively stored neurophysiologically in our memory. FSAP focuses on resolving pleasurable experiences which have been maladaptively stored neurophysiologically in our memory. While I will not be formally reviewing EMDR or FSAP today, both heavily influenced Dr. Nicolosi Jr.'s development of the reintegrative protocol. Now, what I've just outlined are three different sets of therapeutic technique. Proper technique is a necessary part of mastering reintegrative therapy, but it will be impossible to execute this technique without the proper therapeutic stance. Correct technique that is executed with improper therapeutic stance is not really correct technique. I will now characterize this essential element of therapeutic stance from two perspectives: the therapist's internal experience of therapeutic stance and the key behavioral components of proper therapeutic stance that come across to a client. So first, the therapist's internal experience. When I say the therapist's internal experience, I mean the feelings that the therapist has toward the client when the therapist has the right stance. This acronym here, this English acronym COAL, C-O-A-L, comes from Dan Siegel's The Mindful Brain. The therapist, a therapist in the proper stance is curious about what it's like to be the client. That is what we're curious about. Oftentimes, I think we're curious about why a client is feeling a particular way or how, but what I'm actually talking about here is being curious about what the client is experiencing and wanting to enter into that experience with the client. A therapist in the proper stance is also open to whatever the client presents, regardless of the therapist's presuppositions. If I have read Joseph Nicolosi Sr.'s Shame and Attachment Loss, and I have a particular grid through which I'm looking at a client and thinking, oh, this is why he has the same-sex attraction, I need to be careful with that client to be open to anything that might contradict my presuppositions. The client is the expert on his own experience. The client is the expert on his own experience. So I need to be open to whatever the client is describing to me and reflecting that back to him. The third component is the therapist accepts the client as he is even if the therapist does not approve of the client's choices. Any of us who have done work with men with unwanted SSA or have done work with people who experience any sort of addictive behavior know that relapse is part of the recovery process. Whether we like it or not, it happens. And so it's very important to the therapeutic process that when our clients come in, that while we do not accept particular behaviors that a client does, and we're open about that, we still clearly express to the client that we are accepting of them as people. The fourth, and I think most important component of proper therapeutic stance, and this may almost sound unprofessional, but I do really believe this is the most important component of proper therapeutic stance, is that the therapist must love the client. If you do not love your clients, they will know. And what I mean by that is that the therapist wants what is best for the client. The way for therapists to foster COAL is to consistently work on their own, his or her own countertransference. As you work on your own countertransference, your feelings about the client or the person you're working with, that client, that person will experience the therapist's behavior in the most healing way. What I'm saying here is not that you have to have all of your emotional problems healed in order to be a reintegrative therapist. But you must be working on them in such a way that you are consistently strengthening your ability to be curious about what it is actually like to be your client, that you'll be open to whatever the client is experiencing and be able to put your own presuppositions and prejudices to the side, and that you are able to accept the client regardless of his worldview or his choices, and that you must want what is best for your client. You must consistently be fostering these attitudes within yourself. Tuning into these internal attitudes allows the therapist the ability to display behavior that is most conducive toward therapeutic change. I'm borrowing this aspect of therapeutic stance from Susan Johnson's emotionally focused couples therapy. When the therapist is in this healing posture, his behavior will take the form of this acronym, RISK. A client here, in proper therapeutic stance, a client will hear the therapist repeating key words and phrases over and over as the therapist seeks to tune in to the client's internal world. As the client presents his own experience, the most significant parts of the client's experience will take the forms of images or visceral descriptions of that client's experience. And the therapist needs to embrace those images and visceral descriptions. And he needs to reflect that back as he's showing the client that he is entering into the client's world. These next four are fairly self-explanatory: soft tone, slow pace, simple language, and using the client's words as much as possible. I actually find the most difficult one of these components to implement, at least for me, is this one, the simple language one, is actually really difficult. Because I think as therapists, we have a natural inclination toward teaching. And we have a jargon that you've already heard me use many of the words from. And so we have a propensity toward moving towards more complex and difficult language as we're trying to describe things to clients. Very important thing to foster as you're working with clients is simplicity of language, especially when you're moving into deep emotional experiences of a client and you want to keep them in more of a right brain, body-oriented stance. You need to be using simple language. Assuming proper therapeutic stance will establish a natural flow as the therapist takes the client through the phases and steps of the reintegrative protocol. And now we're ready to look at this protocol in greater detail. The reintegrative therapy protocol is comprised of 9 steps broken into 4 phases. And what you'll see here is phase 1, which has steps 1 and 2. Step 1 will look very familiar. Obtain history, frequency, and context of the client's symptoms. And for behavioral addictions, this is the addictive behavior that the client is seeking to resolve. Step 2, evaluate the client for safety factors that determine whether he has the coping skills and integrative capacity to manage potentially high levels of negative feelings. In other words, clients need to be able to have the proper coping skills to continue to live their lives as they're going to very deep and difficult, painful situations. And that has to be part of our treatment process. Now, phase 1 represents the part of the reintegrative protocol that is universal to any evidence-based and helpful therapeutic approach. In this phase, it is particularly important to reintegrative therapy that as you identify the symptoms that the client is seeking to resolve, you determine exactly what the client wants from therapy. By clarifying goals, the client now knows that what he is experiencing is not so-called conversion therapy. In reintegrative therapy, the client determines the direction of therapy, not the therapist. After phase 1 is complete, the stage is set for the phases of the protocol that are distinctive to the reintegrative protocol. Phase 2, preparation. Step 3. Explain the reintegrative protocol and how complex emotions can sometimes lie beneath our traumas and addictions, and how self-compassion can help with their resolution. In this phase, it's important to help the client recognize how he experiences self-compassion and affirmation, and how these experiences differ from how he experiences shame and defensive detachment. I find this most helpful, the most helpful way to help clients distinguish this through intensive body work, being able to identify when I'm in affirmation, when I'm in compassion, I feel tall, I feel open, I feel a warmth in my heart, I have clarity of speech. When I'm in shame and defensive attachment, I'm pulling away, I'm slumped down. These are important things to begin to help the client recognize during this step. And this is where you begin to translate treatment goals with therapeutic process goals. And what I mean is, when the client comes in, they oftentimes have a very clear treatment goal, which is to reduce their symptom. And in this case, for many of our clients, it's unwanted same-sex attraction. But our process goal is for him to get better and better at experiencing self-compassion and self-affirmation. Also during this step, if EMDR therapy may be appropriate for resolving trauma, information about EMDR therapy for processing disturbing memories can be provided at this time. Now we move to the core of reintegrative work. In phases 3 and 4, the client most tangibly experiences the corrective emotional experiences that facilitate healing. Phase 3 assessment, step 4. Identify the specific element of the target behavior that has the most emotional intensity with it. Now, very important to this step is this word specific. Specificity. The more specific a client can be in his description of his experience, the more he feels the therapist on the inside of his experience with him, the more healing this therapy will be. At this point in the therapeutic process, I will say something along the lines of, I want you to picture fully indulging whatever the addictive behavior we are working on is. And I want you to describe this for me in as much detail as you can. The client may describe going to a bathhouse, hooking up through an online app, or going online to view pornography or go to a video chat. As the client describes, the therapist reflects back. Very important here is that the therapist is actually imagining what the client is describing. I will frequently reflect back the client's experience using words like, so what I'm picturing is, or so what I imagine is, and it's very important to use present tense language to show you are walking beside the client through the experience. I will usually do a full overview of the activity with the client, making sure I'm picturing it along with them before I take the client into an even deeper layer of specificity. I will say something like, now I want you to replay the video we just described in your mind. As you do so, I want you to identify the moment or the image that represents the most intense or most satisfying part of the experience, and I want you to describe it to me. The client might describe making eye contact with an attractive man across a bathhouse. He might describe another man propositioning him through an online app. He may describe admiring an attractive man's physique or a specific element of a sex act. Again, it is important that the therapist reflect it back, showing he is actually picturing along with the client's description. Therapeutic stance becomes very critical in this step. The therapist embodying curiosity, openness, acceptance, gives the client a healing experience of compassion in the face of usually immense amounts of shame and anxiety that is around these behaviors and these experiences. Once the therapist and client have identified and experienced together the exact moment or image, now they're ready to tune into the client's internal response to the addictive behavior. Step 5. Identify the specific feelings associated with the most powerful moment of the sexual experience and allow the client to experience this feeling as intensely as he can. I believe the best way to help the client tune in and describe the experience is to direct the client, again, back down into his body. As you picture this, I'll say something along the lines of, as you picture this incredible strong man giving you oral sex while he's staring you directly in the eyes, describe what you notice happening in your body. If the client uses a general term like, I feel a rush or I feel arousal, I will ask them to locate it. Where do you notice that arousal or that rush in your body? Once the client locates the feeling, I'll ask, what sensations do you notice in that part of your body? And the client may describe pleasurable sensations like an energy, an openness, a strength, or a solidity. I'll then ask the client to expand, and I'll say, stay in that moment. Do you notice any other positive feelings in your body? Okay? We want to do as full an inventory as possible of the client's experience of the positive feelings. Now, it's not uncommon during this time. It's hard because clients have so much shame and anxiety around these experiences that they'll start to describe negative affect or discomfort associated with the experience. What I do when that happens is I notice and I honor the negative experience, but then I redirect back into the positive feelings. I'll say something along the lines of, okay, stay with that shame, that desire to withdraw for a few moments, okay? Notice it there, but now let's go back to the pleasurable feelings that you were just describing. You were describing a warmth, an openness, a strength that you felt in that key moment of the experience. Once we've made as full an inventory of the positive feelings as we can, I'll direct the client to begin to give a name to the positive experience. A way I like to do this is to say something along the lines of, I want you to allow that energy in your chest and emanating through your body to take over. As you do, What do you believe about yourself in this moment? The client will report such positive things like, I am strong, or I am masculine, or I am free, or I am safe, or I am connected, or I'm alive. I then ask the client to amplify the feeling as much as he can. I will say things like, I want you to really lean into this moment and the positive feelings you are having. Amplify them up as high as you can. Let me know when you have them as intense as you can have them. Once the client has reached the point of highest intensity in his positive affect, we're ready for the most unique element of the reintegrative protocol. Step 6. Ask the client to imagine taking a stance of being outside of himself in the third person and look deeply and directly into his own eyes and notice what he sees. I'll now ask the client to shift his perspective. I'll say something along the lines of, I want you to stay in this exact moment, but I want you to imagine taking a step outside of yourself, turning around and looking directly and deeply into your own eyes. And let's stay here for a while. I want you to describe everything you see as you look into his eyes. So important in this step is being slow, taking your time during this step, okay? And also to maintain a third-person perspective. The client, as he's describing this, he may describe feelings in the first person, like, I'm in a trance, but the therapist must reflect it back in the third person. So I'll say something along the lines of, so as you look into his eyes, you see he is in a trance. Stay with that. Look deep into that trance in his eyes. Let's see what else you see in there. You can hear again the curiosity. I want to know everything that you're seeing there as you're looking into his eyes. Okay? As the client and I take our time and take full inventory of the feelings seen in the client's eyes, there are 3 layers in the descriptions that we usually move through. The first and outermost layer the client will most often see is his trance state. The client will describe the pleasure or the high he sees his other self experiencing. The therapist's job at this point is simply to reflect it back and hold him there. I'll say things like, great, take your time, stay with that. See that pleasure in his eyes. Look as directly and deeply into that as you can. As the client moves down through the trance states, he'll start to identify underlying emotional desires. He'll say something about the other self saying he wants to feel loved or he wants to feel safe. Again, I want to continue to hold him there and look as directly and deeply into that as he can. Eventually, the client will begin to describe underlying painful needs. There's an emptiness in there, something like that, or he is lonely, he is sad, he doesn't know who he is. When I reach this innermost layer, I will frequently see a significant shift in the client's affect through a change in body posture or a change in vocal tone or intensity. Once the client has hit this bottom layer, I still want to keep him there a little longer. I'll say, look as deeply as you can into that sadness and loneliness. Lean into it as much as you can as you are staring into his eyes. Let me know when you feel like you have most deeply connected to it. Once the client has fully connected to the innermost feeling from the third person in his own eyes, we're ready to find our way back to his underlying trauma. Step 7. Ask the client to associate back to an earlier memory from the third person perspective. Now, very important here, I want the client to stay in the third person as he does this float back to a moment when he experienced that deep underlying painful need. I'll say, stay connected with the sadness and pain you see in his eyes. Tell me about a time when he felt that the most intensely. If the client is silent for a little bit at this time, that is actually a good sign. Okay? They're reflecting back. They're taking their time connecting with the memory that has the most intensity to it. So just wait patiently. The client will begin to relay an important memory of emotional rejection or deprivation related to the feeling he is having. Again, I will usually do a once-through overview like I did with the description of the addictive behavior. We will go through the full video of the memory. I will continue to reflect the description back to him in the third person and in the present tense, like I did in the original image. I'll say something along the lines of, so you see your younger self there being bullied by his older brother. There's no one there to protect him. His dad is reading a book in the corner. And when your younger self is finally able to, he just runs to his room and he hides. Then I will ask the client to replay it and identify the key, most disturbing moment of that image. I'll say something like, I want you to replay that video of that memory in your head again, still in the third person. You're watching your younger self. And as you're watching him go through that, I want you to identify the moment or the image in that video that represents the most disturbing part of that memory. Again, I want you to reflect it back in the third person, okay? As you're talking back to the client, you reflect it back in the third person. Now we are ready to move to what is perhaps the most powerful phase in this protocol. Reintegration. Step 8, begin to resolve the earlier trauma memory using mindful self-compassion. I'll say something like, as you stay in that moment with your younger self, I want you to look directly into his eyes. What do you see when you look into his eyes? The client will then describe pain, loneliness, fear, shame he sees his younger self having. The therapist should reflect that back and ask, is there more about that? Keep in mind that this is an aspect of the client's personhood he has to some degree walled off from himself. So very often his automatic response to this part of himself is anxiety or guilt or shame and sometimes even repulsion. For this reason, it's very important to slow down during this time and make sure that the client is fully emotionally connecting with this younger part of himself. Otherwise, the therapist runs the risk of not getting the client the necessary amount of self-compassion as he continues this step. When the client confirms there's nothing further he sees in his younger self's eyes, the therapist should ask the client to identify how he feels in response to what he sees in his younger self's eyes. If the client is fully emotionally connected to his younger self, he will describe a compassion or a love he feels for his younger self. And I will try to deepen this feeling by asking the client to locate it in his body. Where do you feel that compassion in your body? There in your heart? Good. Describe the sensations you feel in your heart as you feel that compassion. The client will again describe sensations like warmth, openness, and impulses toward his younger self. There may also be negative affect mixed in there, sadness for his younger self, a heaviness or a weight or an emptiness. Or he might also describe anger on behalf of his younger self against attachment figures that failed at that point in his life. I will then encourage the client, I will then encourage the client to express that compassion and love, Lost part of my manuscript. I'm going to be going off of memory. when the client confirms there's nothing further he sees in his younger self's eyes, the therapist should then ask the client to express that compassion to his younger self. Okay, what do you want to do? As you're looking into his eyes and you see his sadness, you see his emptiness and loneliness, and now you're feeling this compassion, you're feeling this warmth, this openness. You want to move toward him. I want you to actually picture that. Hey, when you picture doing that, when you picture moving toward your younger self and hugging him there, how do you picture him responding? Oh yeah, you picture him crying, you picture him sobbing. You know, he's never had this kind of comfort before. Yeah, keep holding him there. As you hold him there, what happens? Good. And what you're wanting to do is, as they're moving through this healing connection with their younger self, they'll eventually reach a resting point, a particular point of resolution where there'll be a peace or there'll be a calm. And at this point, what I will want to do is to begin to consolidate the experience that the client just had. Okay, now in this more peaceful, in this more calm place, okay, what does your younger self know about himself in this moment? And he'll maybe describe, my younger self, now he feels safe, or now he feels good, or now he feels like a man. Say, good, excellent. And now as you're looking into his eyes, okay, what does he know about you in that moment? He knows I'm going to take care of him. He knows that I'm going to walk through this with him. Once we have fully identified and resolved this key moment in the client's past, we're ready to move on to step 9, the final step in this protocol, which is to ask the client to go back to the original sexual fantasy or memory identified back in phase 3. When I take the client back here, he is usually in a completely different state of mind. He will say things like, I don't need to do that anymore, or I can't get that need met another way, or I can get that need met another way. This is the first and only time when we invite the client to analyze his feelings and behaviors. And this is also the only time when we offer interpretations to the client of what he is experiencing. Good questions to ask the client at this time are, what do you notice about this fantasy that you didn't know when we started? What do you think the connection is between your fantasy and the memory that we just processed with your younger self? When we apply this protocol to men with unwanted same-sex attraction, one thing should become abundantly apparent. Change in sexuality is a byproduct of our work, not its goal. The goal of our work is to resolve trauma, shame, and defensiveness. All other changes in feeling or behavior arise as a byproduct. Later this evening, I'm actually going to be doing a live demonstration. A man has actually agreed to do a session of this kind of therapy with me in front of you all. We're very grateful and honored that he has been willing to invite us into that. So just so you know, you will get to see this illustrated. Questions of morality or questions about the healthiness of homosexuality, whether it is disordered or not, are completely sidestepped in this process. Indeed, as I've said, most incredibly, this protocol could be implemented by a completely pro-gay therapist. And if he were to truly implement it with curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love, if our clinical experience holds true, his same-sex attracted client may discover for himself that his homosexuality is, as Dr. Nicolosi Jr. says, a compensatory phenomenon, an attempt to restore affect regulation and sense of identity, and therefore remediate the effects of formative dysregulated experiences created by trauma and neglect experiences from the client's developmental years. Thank you very much.